How's it going, everybody? Rybread here today, and we are back on the Faceoff Dot. And with me is John. As today's topic, we will be continuing our offseason breakdown with the Anaheim Ducks.
Hey everybody, I'm really excited to talk about this team. They're an interesting one, not like a lot of other franchises.
They do have it's a franchise that I think has a bright future and hasn't even hit hasn't hit their potential that they should have hit in recent memory.
Yeah, it's definitely peculiar. They have a lot of guys coming up, but they also have guys like Getzlaf and Perry and Kessler, who are the old forward core that's coming out.
But, you know, this new wave of the NHL is built around the defensemen, and while everyone talks about Getzlaf and Perry and the forwards they have, let's highlight their defensemen a little bit, because Anaheim was rumored to be shipping one of these defensemen out for like 6 years now. But not 6 years, but you guys know what I mean. But they've got a ton of defensemen. I mean, Fowler and Lindholm as left-handed shots, and then Vatanen, Montour, and Manson, all very good right-handed shots. Some of those guys are younger, though, and still got to prove a full season's worth.
Yeah, they have one of the best defensive cores in the league, for sure. Up there with Nashville, Carolina, Anaheim's right up there. And they are young, definitely.
You know, it's nice to hear you mention Carolina, because I think a lot of people overlook Carolina's defensive core. But anyway, you know, they had an even more stacked the defensive core before the expansion draft.
Oh, yeah. In the expansion draft, they wanted to keep that very top defenseman, especially, I think especially just that core they have. So they had to give up Theodore and Stoner in order to keep a guy like Manson.
Yeah, and you know, a guy like Vatanen was also very highly touted for Vegas to take, because he's got that, I think, $4.5 million cap hit, I believe, is around what his cap hit would be, which would help them get to the cap floor, which they didn't have a problem with. But he's also a very good defenseman. I might add, though, that he's coming off, I believe, a shoulder surgery that might keep him out until, you know, a couple weeks into the season, believe it or not.
Yeah, I think players bounce back from that kind of stuff, though, if they're at this point in their career. If they're young, you know, it can be something more worried about, but he's old enough where he's developed and established. And another defenseman we should talk about is Cam Fowler. A lot of talk about trading him, but he just 2 days ago signed an 8-year, $6.5 million average annual value contract. So I think that's a really solid cap hit for them. You know, the cap's should hopefully go up in the next couple of years, and that's looking like what a top four defenseman might break in, especially a really good defenseman like him.
Right, and since we're on the topic of cap hit, it only makes sense to move on to the forwards, where I think they're going to have their biggest trouble in a couple of years. You know, we all know about guys like Getzlaf and Perry, but their cap hit for what they produce is great right now, but a few years down the road, when they're not nearly as good as they are now, they're still going to have this ridiculous cap hit.
Yeah, Getzlaf and Perry. The thing is, though, Perry, I don't think he's going to... I don't know. It's tough to tell because they play a hard grinding style, which means they might drop off a little earlier. But they also, Perry anyway, doesn't rely on his skating. And so I think that he might fare a little bit better because he won't lose that step.
Right. I definitely think...
it'll be interesting to see.
I definitely think a guy like Getzlaf can translate more to like a Joe Thornton type of guy where, you know, he's not necessarily using his skating or speed, but then becomes more of his... I mean, they're both big bodies. Both Getzlaf and Perry, like you said, play a grinding style of game. But they could definitely still use their physical presence and, you know, maybe not be true first-liners anymore, but could still provide valuable minutes even in their waning years of their careers.
Yeah, I mean, Getzlaf is such a talented passer. He's got such great vision. And I think a guy like Kessler, too, is another guy who can play a more hard-nosed game, but is just one of the best defensive forwards in the game. So it'll be interesting to see how they age. I don't know if they will age with grace or really drop off. We'll see.
But the good news for them, though, is when that drop-off does come, they've got some good young forwards currently playing in the NHL. Guys like Jacob Silfverberg, Nick Ritchie, and Rickard Rakell all have gotten some serious NHL ice time and seem to be pretty good and seem to be a good core for the future.
Yeah, and Rickard Rakell is signed to a fairly cheap deal for the next couple of years at least. That came because a little bit of history from earlier this year. He stayed in Sweden for the first, about month of the season because he was locked out of contract negotiations. So as a restricted free agent, you can't just sign with another team. So it was tough negotiating, but I think it worked out in Anaheim's favor. Even though they didn't get to keep him, he played like a man on fire for the rest of the season.
Oh, for darn sure. And even if these young guys that are playing in the NHL don't turn out to be anything special, they got some special prospects in the system that may not have played in the NHL yet.
Yeah, we should definitely talk about Sam Steele. Man, that guy, he is a steal. Drafted 30th or around there.
In the second round,
I
I
think.
think.
30th overall.
Something like that.
Well, he was originally he got the pick that they selected him with. It was a great trade for them. They traded away Anderson because they went with Gibson as their top goalie, who we'll talk about in a second. But traded away Anderson in the Toronto Maple Leafs last year, and ended up selecting Sam Steele, who was highly skilled but dropped down in the draft for whatever reason. And I think they're really excited about that guy. He's looking real good.
Yeah, I've seen some of his highlight videos, and you're right. The guy's got pure skill, and I'm also gonna say that you were right. You can say I told you so. He was drafted 30th overall in 2016. But some other players of note that maybe didn't have a first round pick this year, but I certainly think they killed it in the draft. They had 2 seconds, 50th overall. They picked Maxime Comtois, and then 60th overall, 10 picks later, they pick his buddy Antoine Morand, and I think that's a 1-2 punch that we might be seeing in a few years, sort of like we're seeing Getzlaf Perry.
Yeah, I think Comtois is a really good pick. He dropped because he had a little bit of a lackluster season, but he's still a highly skilled forward and had a good season the year before. So I think, players have slumps, but I think it's a worthwhile risk to take, and it's not really that much for a risk at 50th overall anyway.
Exactly. And now moving on towards the season that they had with this team, and more importantly the playoffs, because we figured they were going to be a good regular season team as they usually are, but when it came playoff time, they actually, they got all the way to the Western Conference Finals, but ran into the Nashville Predators, who are on their tear to the Stanley Cup. I mean, if I'm an Anaheim fan, you got to be happy with a Western Conference Finals appearance, but at some point you got to be saying, when is it our turn to make it to the Stanley Cup?
Yeah, I don't know if you're saying you're happy with the Western. I mean, happier than not making the playoffs, but you definitely have to be expecting something more in the coming years, because the window's going to close eventually. I know they have a young defensive core, but they still Getzlaf, Perry, and Kessler won't last forever. So I think you got to be asking the questions of, hey, Perry, Getzlaf, Kessler, let's go. You don't have very long.
Yeah, and fun stat of the day, the Anaheim Ducks during the regular season, when they were trailing after 2 periods, were 1-24-3. They only came back 1 time after trailing after entering the 3rd period.
That is not a good stat to have if you want to be a playoff team, because I think every team that did well in the playoffs had a couple comebacks, so...
Yeah, for sure. And just to show that, maybe this team isn't clutch. Is it coaching then, or is it just the mentality of the players? Because they've switched coaches, but, guys like Getzlaf and Perry have been there a while. Is it maybe the mentality in the locker room?
I don't know. That's tough to tell, but it is the kind of question you have to ask to your leadership core. They already did switch coaches. Bruce Boudreau got fired after that. Oh, man, that season where Chicago took them, and then... just losing Game 7s, it hurts. It hurts. So I think that Randy Carlyle was he was kind of a risky pick. He hadn't really done well recently, but he's won a cup and he won it with Anaheim. So I think it was a solid guy to bring back.
Oh, yeah, for sure. That cup just coming a few years ago over the Ottawa Senators, believe it or not, who they could have matched up with in the Stanley Cup Finals.
They could have. That was close. Would have been quite the rematch, but it did not happen. And that was, that was Randy Carlyle out of nowhere. I think that people will. He definitely proved the haters wrong this year.
Oh yeah, for sure, without a doubt. And as far as this team making it to the Stanley Cup Finals, like you're saying, these guys aren't getting any younger. Yeah, their future looks bright, but we don't know how this team is going to play in 2-3 years. So. Are Getzlaf and Perry going to hit that wall we were talking about? I mean, they certainly seem to be a dominant punch, although Perry was a little bit absent for most of the playoffs, if you ask me.
A little bit, yeah, definitely. But he still makes an impact in just the grinding game. I think Jonathan Quick wrote a really good Players Tribune article about elite snipers, and he talked about Perry and Getzlaf and just their grinding style. And even when they're not scoring goals, they're still wearing the other team out, and it has an impact and can really open things up for the other guys on the team.
Oh, right. Yeah, for sure. And, I did say Perry seemed a little bit, I couldn't see him during the playoffs. He did show up in overtime. I believe he scored a couple of game winners for Anaheim. And, I was calling into question whether is this team clutch or not. It certainly doesn't seem like the regular season they can mount a comeback. But they did fine in the playoffs, I guess you could say. When it came to overtime, I mean, that's when Corey Perry, and that's when you need your star players to step up, and Corey Perry sure did.
Yeah, and the series against Nashville definitely would have been a different series had they had Gibson and not Bernier as the backup, which they got rid of Bernier and they went out. Let's talk about their goalies. They acquired Ryan Miller, who I think is a great addition.
Oh, I certainly think that. I did see that he is very close to overtaking for the most wins by an American-born goaltender.
Yeah, who currently has that? Do you know?
I'm gonna go ahead and check that out for you, but
maybe Van Beesbrook. I'm not really sure, but yeah, he definitely. Ryan Miller had a great season with Vancouver, and I say great. Vancouver didn't have the best season, but with the defense they had, I think that Ryan Miller just really showed that he can do something with any team, and he is definitely an underrated goalie, and they got him for cheap, so what a solid pickup. And I don't think he would have the same kind of collapse that Bernier did against Nashville, so
although he hasn't,
definitely a solid goalie.
He hasn't proven necessarily to be, clutch in the playoffs. He hasn't necessarily been, the reason teams have lost in the playoffs, but I can certainly think, he carried Team USA that year in the Olympics to a silver medal, but he did not have his best game in the gold medal. There were times when he was here in Buffalo that he didn't have his best game when we would have needed it, but, he's not the number one guy to blame.
I think that, if you watch that last game with Bernier, all they needed was a guy to not lose the game. And Bernier lost the game for them. So, if Ryan Miller can just not lose, that would be good. That would be good enough for that team. And he's just a backup.
Oh, yeah.
That's really just an emergency situation. It's not like he's coming for Gibson's spot. He's the solid it's Gibson's team. So.
Oh, yeah. And to answer your question about who he's chasing Tom Barrasso of the Pittsburgh Penguins, who has 369 wins. Ryan Miller has 358 wins in 76 less games played.
I would not have guessed that. I would not have guessed that.
Yeah, I know. That's if any of you out there guessed that one, good for you. But because I was not guessing that one off the top of my head.
Yeah. Well. Anyway, those are the goalies. I think they are looking good because Gibson is still young, and as long as he doesn't have any more injury trouble, they should be set solid on that front.
And talk about another guy on a very team-friendly contract. We highlighted how negative the contracts for guys like Getzlaf and Perry may become. But, when you got guys like you mentioned, Raquel, and guys like Gibson, both on what I deem to be fantastic contracts for the team, you can still build a cup contender because you want these guys on cheap contracts. And, these aren't the guys on their entry-level contracts that you expect from teams like the Toronto Maple Leafs. But you certainly don't have these guys tied up for $6 million like they probably should be, $5-6 million. You got them on $3 million deals, basically.
What is Gibson? Do you have the numbers?
Gibson, I believe, is $3 million for 3 years.
I mean, that is a bridge deal, but and I think that's a good one because they want to contend for those next 3 years, and then he can get his payday afterwards.
Right. Yes. It's John Gibson is making $2.3 million through this season and next season, and then a guy like Ricard Raquel. Yeah, oh yeah, for sure. And Ricard Raquel is making about $3.8 million. I'll round it up to through the 2021-2022 season.
Another steal.
They got Jacob Silverberg locked up for $3.75 for the next 2 seasons.
See, that's how they're able to contend even with monster contracts of Getzlaf, Perry, and Kessler.
Although, if I were a Ducks fan, I might be looking at next season and looking at some of the guys that I'm going to have to resign and actually give a decent paycheck to. One guy that sticks out is Nick Ritchie. He's going to want a bigger contract than his entry-level contract.
But I think they'll look at another bridge deal kind of thing like they did with Raquel or Gibson.
For sure. And then Josh Manson as well is an RFA next year.
Yeah, the defenseman might be the tough. I think Nick Ritchie they can sign for lower, but the defensemen that are playing tough minutes are going to ask for more, especially a guy like Manson. He obviously has a lot of leverage if they traded away Theodore and
Stoner.
Oh, man. Stoner, thank you. In order to keep him, I think that he has a lot of leverage to get a lot of money because they don't want to lose him for nothing.
Oh, and here's another guy to add to that list of players they need to sign next year, Brandon Montour. So there's a big part of their defensive core, that young defensive core is going to want to get paid next year. And they're only going to have about 18, 19 million of cap space next season to sign all these players.
The thing is, though, they have other guys coming up, like Larson, who can replace these other defensemen. We might see a trade of one of these defensemen out of there to bring another one of their prospects up and not spend too much to the cap.
Oh, yeah, for sure. They've got only, if you're not counting if you count entry-level contracts as well, not any of the guys that, I'm not going to count a guy like Jacob Larson here, but they got 4 defensemen under contract next season, and they've got $18.6 million in cap space. Plus, they're only going to have about 6 forwards signed, so I'm pretty interested to see what Anaheim does at the trade deadline, first of all, but more importantly, next offseason.
Yeah, definitely. That'll be something to keep an eye on.
I think it's one of those situations that we're seeing with the Washington Capitals. When you've got these stars and you're a perennial cup contender, how long can you keep that up, especially when guys get paid? It's all about the scouting and the front office, how they draft. Do they draft players that can step in and replace on these entry-level contracts, or can you find cheaper talent, in-depth talent, like guys like maybe a Patrick Eaves, but he even got a decent contract coming up.
Yeah, Patrick Eaves is a guy that was definitely worth the trade from Dallas, I think, and then this free agency signing. I think that was a solid pickup.
Oh yeah, I'm kind of hesitant about a guy making $3.15 million at 33 for the next 3 years.
That is a tough one.
But, we saw something like the Toronto Maple Leafs do that with Patrick Marleau. So, these guys are making this money through to their mid to late 30s. But you bring them in there to be good leaders, good veterans, and maybe bring these young guys along. Nick Ritchie's only 21, and I certainly think he'd look up to a guy like Patrick Eaves.
Yeah, but I don't think you can be signing. For a team like Toronto, it makes more sense since they're so young. But if Kessler, Perry, and Getzlaf aren't doing that job well enough, then you got another problem.
Well, that's true. You got a whole leadership issue there. Maybe that's why they're not quite good enough when it comes down to they're trailing after 2. They're trailing after 1 isn't much better either. They only won 3 games out of 19 chances there, and when they're trailing after one period. Wow,
that's crazy.
So if they're losing at the end of any period, they've only won 4 times this past season. That stat to me is pretty telling, because it means if they don't jump out to an early lead, they're not going to win a ton of games.
Yeah, I think that you can see those stats change from year to year, though. But that's definitely one that is not a good look.
I'm thinking this brings back to your point earlier about how this team is a little bit more of a grinding team and how they play that physical style of game. Can they keep it up? And I think that, a grinding style of hockey just naturally leads to more defensive game. They were 31, 9-5 when scoring first, but, and then those numbers I said when they're trailing at the end of a period, I think that's pretty telling how dominant they are when they're winning versus, how poor they are when they're losing.
Yeah, grinding teams can definitely benefit from an early lead more than other teams, and can be hurt from an early deficit.
And that's why I think the signing of Ryan Miller is important, because he may not be your starting goaltender, he may not be your number one, but he's probably going to get the job done for you more so than a guy like Bernier when Gibson needs that relief.
Yeah, that's definitely such an important pickup. So key especially when you see the job Bernier did. Who I think Bernier got signed also. I can't remember who.
I don't know where he would have gone, but
I think it was just today actually. But I'm not sure. It might have been Calgary. I don't know.
Yeah, but definitely Ryan Miller would be an upgrade in my book. Some other signings, they got Tokarski for a little bit of depth, saying Miller possibly gets injured. He's getting up there in age. And then a forward, Derek Grant, who's bounced around a couple of teams, could be a decent guy that could come up in case.
He cannot score to save his life. He's been on both Buffalo and Nashville and cannot score.
No, not at all. But, I mean, that's not necessarily what the Anaheim Ducks need. I think they need pure goal-scoring talent. But, he's a depth guy. He's not going to be a second liner, somebody that's going to come in and make an impact. He's going to be a guy that'll give you good minutes off the bench.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, he was going to get signed by somebody, so.
Yeah, he's a very good depth player for the league.
I like him.
So, where do you have this team finishing up this next season? And do you see them maybe making it to the Stanley Cup Finals, or are they going to fall short?
If I'm a Ducks fan, this is going to hurt, but I think they lose to the Edmonton Oilers in whatever round they meet up in. Could be the conference finals, could be the second round, but we'll see how that shakes out. But I don't see him making it past McDavid.
It could even be the first round, assuming that neither of those teams gets the first seed in the Pacific.
Or you never know where they'll shake out, but I think they lose to the Oilers.
Yeah, I definitely think that the speed and the talent of the Oilers, their resurgence of late with the speed style of game that the NHL is going to. And now I'm not saying that the Ducks don't have speed, and their style has certainly been successful over the previous years, having very decent playoff runs, probably not as good as their fans would have hoped, but I definitely think they can make it into the second round. But like you said, if they meet up with the Oilers, I'm with you on that one. I think they don't match up well against a team like that. I know they just beat them this year.
They did just beat them, but I think the Oilers, now 1 year older, more experienced, and they are a generally younger team, and I don't think McDavid loses a series against them.
No, I definitely think that team, he's going to have another year. He's going to get better, which is kind of scary to think.
It's terrifying.
But yeah, I don't see them making the Stanley Cup. Well, thank you guys so much for listening. Have a happy 4th of July to all you listening out there. And thanks for listening to another edition of the Faceoff Dot.